All right, good morning. All right, thank you for joining our first ever event affiliated with MD&M. We're here today to discuss the current trends in medical device contract manufacturing and mergers and acquisition. My name is Carlos Timamilio. I'm a partner with Alira Health, and I head the North America contract manufacturing practice. Alira Health is a global service and consulting organization focused on driving innovation in the life sciences. And our different practices assist global MedTech and biopharmaceutical companies in a variety of challenges, from clinical affairs, patient engagement, market access, as well as corporate strategy and investment banking. And our CDMO group that is hosting this event supports corporate and financial sponsors and entrepreneurs in maximizing their value during M&A transactions, as well as achieving sustainable growth post-merger. A couple of years ago, we started publishing the research from our professional insight on trends in medical device outsourcing. And by doing so, we leveraged a community of contributors and clients, partners, and friends that made our report insightful and useful for our industry. And we did that with the intent of fostering relationship, the sense of network, and business opportunities, of course. So we want to thank all our contributors that have made this effort very successful and very helpful for a variety of stakeholders. This is the first time we try to bring our friends, our community under the same roof to present the insight of our research. So we appreciate all of you taking some time off a busy schedule of the conference and to be here today. The program is quite exciting. In a minute, my colleague Campbell Rolig will get on stage and present the key takeaways from our M&A tracker in medical device CDMO. It is an excerpt of our most recent 2022 industry report, which you can all download from the QR codes that you find on the flyers on top of your table. And then we'll jump on the highlight of the day, which is a fantastic executive roundtable. I have the privilege of hosting here great business leaders and deal makers and get some of their insight and expertise here out in the open. So with that, I want to thank you for being here. And Campbell, please, he will entertain you with a presentation. See you in a bit.
Thank you, Carlo, and thank you all for being here today. So my name is Campbell Rolig. I am an investment banker with Alira Health. And as Carlo mentioned, in addition to our work as deal makers within the space, for a few years now, we've been publishing our research within the industry. And I'm up here today to introduce the topic of conversation that our panel will be addressing, which is the M&A activity within the medical device CDMO space in 2021 and beyond. Now, as many of you may know, last year we saw a new all-time high in M&A activity within this sector, completing 52 deals over the course of the year versus 32 in 2020. Private equity platform building was a large driver of this M&A activity throughout the year, with 35 transactions of the 52 being private equity related, as strategic acquisitions were relatively flat year over year, with 17 versus 15 in 2020. Now, as expected, certain areas served by the acquired CDMOs contribute more to these record volumes than others, indicating trends across both the outsourced and OEM markets. Design and development services were of particular interest last year due to their ability to move a platform upstream to acquire customers earlier and capture more value. Now, this upstream integration has a synergistic effect, as the acquiring CDMO not only gains the revenue of its target company, but can extend these development services to its existing customers, and conversely, the target's design customers can be extended along the acquirer's value chain to gain revenue across other services. This trend is in line with the one-stop shop model exercised by the larger platforms and public CDMOs in the space. We also saw a great deal of interest in metals capabilities such as precision machining and metal finishing services, while on the end market side, traditionally high-value end markets such as cardiovascular and minimally invasive surgery continue to be attractive as CDMOs look to increase their footprint in these prized product categories. Now, in analyzing the drivers of M&A activity within the sector, it is just as important to consider the industry stakeholders as it is to look at the trending capabilities and services. As mentioned earlier, private equity-backed CDMOs were the main driver of M&A activity over the course of the year, and notably, 7 of these private equity deals were major private equity exits, with platforms established in the mid-2010s coming to the end of considerable holding periods and changing hands to new private equity sponsors. One of these platforms is represented here today in Resonetics. Thank you, Tom, for being here. And given that these platforms continue to be backed by institutional investors, they will maintain their roles as growth engines and agents of consolidation within the industry. And despite the significant private equity turnover of 2021 following the hiatus of the previous year, we count at least 9 private equity-backed platforms approaching their exit horizons that we believe may exit over the course of this year and next. Now, moving from volumes and into valuations, while we did see a record number of M&A deals in 2021, there were few deals that featured publicly disclosed valuation data. Because of this, our industry valuation estimates did not shift meaningfully year over year, but those deals that did feature available data showed valuations in line or greater than recent averages. That being said, at Alira Health, our experience as bankers and commercial advisors in the space allows us to spend time at the table in these processes and develop a unique perspective on current valuation trends. While competitiveness remains high, we've seen a significant disparity between valuations of differentiated versus commodity-based assets. Furthermore, while a few years ago it seemed everybody was willing to go above market to expand their reach and service portfolios, the pool of aggressive buyers has thinned, and we are seeing increased caution when approaching assets that do not feature high growth or high margin prospects. As a consequence of these factors, we believe valuations may be reaching a plateau. Looking ahead, we see 2021's record volumes as the peak for M&A activity for a while, but expect to see lots of deal making continue into the next couple of years, driven largely by private equity-backed add-on investments. Regarding valuations, the private equity turnover of 2021 thinned the pool of large PE-backed platforms, which will drive several highly competitive processes when they do come to market, and high multiples will follow, sustaining the industry's current valuation parameters. At the end of the day, all of these M&A trends are driven by industry fundamentals, and we expect another strong industry performance in 2022, featuring a continued return to normalcy and expansion into the outsourced market by OEMs. These points are further referenced by our report, which again, you may access using the QR codes on the flyers on your tables. Now at this point, I will hand it back to Carlo and our esteemed panel of industry veterans here, but I will be around afterwards for anyone interested in discussing further. Thank you.
Thank you, Campbell. And it's my pleasure to introduce our fantastic panel today that represents well the diversity of different types of stakeholders that drive and shape the industry consolidation trend in medical device outsourcing. We have a Fortune 500 company represented by Joe Barron in Flex, and 2 specialty manufacturers with highly engineered, sophisticated manufacturing capabilities in Cadence. Jeff Kelly, thanks for being here. And Resonetics, Tom, also thanks for being here. And maybe, gentlemen, we can start from a round of personal introduction. Jeff, you have the mic. Would you like to go first?
Is this on? Good afternoon, everyone. As Carlos said, my name is Jeff Kelly. My role at Cadence is Vice President of Sales and Business Development. I've been with the organization for about 7 years, but have been in the med device and life science space for about 20 years. And cardiovascular areas, as well as diagnostic and medical imaging. Let me tell you a little bit about Cadence. So as Carlos said, Cadence is a specialty medical device contract manufacturer. It was founded about 35 years ago in Stanton, Virginia as an industrial blade company, and over the last 20 years has expanded mainly in the medical space. So we've expanded in terms of capabilities as well as size. So we now have 5 sites across the US with a focus on metal components, so blades, needles, metal cannulas, metal stamping. But we also provide finished device assembly, sterilization management, as well as other contract manufacturing services. The core competency for us, again, is the metal components. And in terms of area of focus for us, advanced surgical, or a market we call advanced surgical, which includes robotic-assisted surgery as well as other surgical applications. And again, when you think about our expertise, about 500 employees, 75 are degreed engineers, so we really enjoy working with customers on complex manufacturing and development programs. So happy to be here. Thanks, Carlo.
Thanks, Jeff.
Hi, I'm Joe Barron. I work at Flex Health Solutions. I've been a member of the Flex team for a little over 4 years. I joined in 2017 after completing my MBA. I've worked with the Health Solutions team for a little over a year. Right now, I am Senior Director of Commercial Strategy and also handle the M&A for the group. Prior to Flex, I actually was a naval officer, so no previous med device experience. I was in the Navy for 11 years. Just a little bit about Flex. So Flex is a large company, $25 billion. We serve myriad end markets. Flex Health Solutions, smaller obviously, we're about $2.5 billion annual revenue. Mostly, I'd say our area of expertise is finished medical devices, a high degree of electromechanical capability, sterilization, disposables, strong degree of plastic injection molding and tooling as well. We like to think that we can serve the OEMs in any region of their choosing with a high degree of capability, regardless of the end product.
Thank you, Joe.
Hi, Tom Burns, President and CEO at Resonetics. I've been with the company about 9.5 years now. I've been in MedTech, one shape or another, since 86, I think it is, and in contract design manufacturing since 98. I've had the good fortune to work with lots of different companies and different PE firms. So I think I've got a taste and can talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of PE ownership. And right now I'd say it's mostly good. Resonetics has been a very active buyer over the 9.5 years, and we're pretty diversified now. From our core roots around laser processing, we've added other adjacent manufacturing capabilities with precision grinding, photochemical machining, and continue to look for high-value processes that hopefully help differentiate us from the crowd. So looking forward to the discussion.
Please keep it. Thanks again, gentlemen. And I would like to kick it off by looking at the data that Campbell just described about record volume of activity. I wonder, in your experience, what took us here? What's happened over the last 5, 6, 7 years during this period of acceleration of industry consolidation? And as deal makers, how do you experience the change in the landscape regarding M&A in our industry?
I'll take the first crack at it. I think our large OEMs in the industry have been talking for years about supplier rationalization, and I think they are actually walking the talk now. So more and more of them do want to reduce the number of suppliers. Part of that's because they've all done so many acquisitions themselves. They have supply chains with thousands of suppliers on them. The FDA is holding them more accountable for value and quality throughout the supply chain. So I think a lot of it has been driven by risk mitigation at the OEM level, and then wanting to deal with fewer, more strategic suppliers. And it makes it a little tough if you're a smaller niche supplier. There's always going to be room for them, don't get me wrong. But more and more, at least the major players want to push their spend into fewer strategic suppliers. And that leaves everybody else fending for the companies that aren't being that aggressive, and there's fortunately plenty of those as well. But I think that's one key dynamic, as well as the sheer amount of capital out there looking for a home and the limited properties.
Yeah, I think, obviously, I agree with everything that Tom just said. If I take it from maybe the acquiring company standpoint, we see in our industry, the EMS industry, many companies talking about shifting their portfolio more towards differentiated end markets. So what does that mean? Medical, automotive, industrial. So those companies looking for growth and margin accretion, but then also even some of the diversified larger manufacturing companies also making acquisitions and being interested in the medical space. That certainly is increasing the activity and driving a lot of competition for the finite number of assets that are out there.
I should have gone first. You guys took my answer. So I agree with all the points there. I would say the other general dynamics that haven't changed as much over the last several years is the underlying economic of the industry. So I think it's still an attractive industry to be in. Despite the OEM consolidation, I think that there are still opportunities to grow and grow at healthy margins within the CMO space. I would say the other piece is the other companies that are entering to get into medical. So it's bringing a lot of new capital into the space. I would say the other factor, which is still to be determined, I'm interested in the conversations this week, is just the impact of COVID, sort of the long-term impact. Obviously, it's having huge impacts on supply chains right now, and it's to be determined what it means for local manufacturing around the world and what companies are doing that are overreacting to COVID situations. So I think that could impact valuations over the next couple of years.
That's a great point, and I think from my perspective, the counterintuitive aspect of this is that the 2021 and 2020, during the pandemic, were also the years with the highest volume of transaction, and so the greed for capital deployment is as high as ever, right? So it would be interesting to see how this trend will normalize after the pandemic. And if we've seen the best of it or not is yet to be determined in my point of view. But on the subject of capital availability, we see obviously private equity trying to enter the space, continue to deploy capital to grow their platforms and seek high multiple exit. All these is fueling valuation and finding acquisition target at normal prices, according to the standard we may have had a decade ago, is getting more and more difficult. In this context, how do you approach your inorganic growth strategy? And can you describe how you view the market and how do you these relatively high valuation inform your decision-making process when you look at a target?
Start, Joe?
It's hard. I mean, as a publicly traded company, right, there's implications, of course, for making an acquisition, especially when you trade at one multiple and the targets trade at another. But we know that's a challenge, right? So we overcome it. I think for us, you're going from a bet your job to a bet your company in some cases with the size of the multiples or, the scale of the company that you're acquiring. So obviously we're being very cautious, but still trying to move fast when we can. For us, at Flex and within Health Solutions, we really need to be able to articulate the future and what, what the combined entity could look like and what the synergies are. For us, it's not about acquiring more scale. It's about acquiring a differentiated technology or capability that then we can deploy across our network, across multiple customers, and create value that way. With us also, another consideration is, can I deploy a technology in any of the other end industries that we participate in as a company? So that maybe is a bit unique among some of the players in the market, but there is a technology convergence that has been happening and will continue to happen, and whether we're talking about flexible batteries or wearables or digital simulations, there is a lot of technology out there that is portable across many industries. So we evaluate that as a matter of course and look to stitch together the value creation story from there.
Yeah, I would just add that to rationalize the high multiples that are out there, there has to be some real compelling strategic reasons for doing the deal. So sometimes you'll see one company bidding high because they do have a customer synergy, a technical synergy, a geographic synergy, whatever. In our case, we look more for growth synergies than cost synergies, but you can do it for either reason. Personally, I think growth is easier to execute on versus consolidating plants and going through that whole process. But I think the prices are requiring buyers to be more discerning because the prices are frothy and I'm not seeing any indication they're going the other way.
That's a great point. And Jeff, maybe before we give you space to address this topic, I have a particular question from Cadence' point of view. So obviously you offer highly engineered, high precision services. Growing in adjacent areas have to mean looking at targets with very high multiple. And the deal maker role is also about deciding when not to execute on an acquisition, right? So coming from the perspective that the space where you operate is particularly competitive, how do you balance organic and inorganic growth at Cadence?
Sure. Well, I guess maybe I can start by answering the previous question a little bit, but that will segue into your question just now. So from a inorganic standpoint, so I'm the one who has to identify and then sign up for the synergies. So I have to be cautious yet aggressive. So a lot of that means understanding what the customer relationships are, how sticky those relationships are. Do they have long-term agreements in place? What does the pipeline look like? So as we know, the sales cycle in this industry is very long. So if you're a viable entity in this, you've got a healthy pipeline that will lead to production next 2 or 3 years. So understanding that. And then the other big piece is the management team. So that's the biggest piece that you're buying when you acquire these companies. So that's what we look at from an inorganic standpoint and a revenue synergy standpoint. When balancing inorganic versus organic, I didn't mention during my intro that Cadence went through a sales process itself about 4 years ago and put ourselves up for sale and ended up finding Kohlberg & Company, a private equity firm based in New York, as our partner. And they've been great to work with. So for them, it's all about growth. It's about growing EBITDA by growing the top line. And so the focus for them is how do we put more capital to work in the business, either through acquisitions or buying equipment or buying people to help us create a platform for growth. So part of what we do within the companies, we've got a cross-functional team from a technical standpoint and a commercial standpoint that are looking at trends in the industry, looking at technology trends, and then mapping them up to say, all right, can we develop that ourselves, or do we need to acquire that expertise? In the case of most recently, we've done some more work in machining. We looked for lots of acquisition opportunities, couldn't find a great fit, So Kohlberg stepped up and allows us to invest in the capital ourselves and buying that equipment and creating that capability.
That's interesting. Sometimes, enhancing your internal capabilities may have a greater ROI than shopping for synergistic assets outside. And our point of view is that a lot of market players are starting to think that way, and there's an increasingly cautious approach to not overpay, frankly, for where it doesn't create obvious synergistic growth opportunities.
It's not quite as fast, though. That's the challenge, is it doesn't happen as quickly if you're not buying those customer relationships and you already have the technology in place. That's the trade-off.
That's right. And, Joe, I see Flex at a very different end of the market from strategic direction, obviously because of your scale. Flex is a multinational, highly diversified organization. You have a lot of manufacturing capacity overseas as well. And I imagine that when you look to or consider to acquire companies, most of your targets will probably be smaller add-ons, right? So business integration, how to exacerbate those synergies is as important as finding the right target and paying the right multiple. So how do you approach that, and how important is it in your M&A strategy?
It's definitely important. It's certainly a factor. We're a relatively lean team, both within Health Solutions and across the organization at Flex in terms of corporate development. So the integration burden is real and will be real regardless of if it's a large company or a smaller company. Regarding regional trends, so I think there's actually two regional trends I think I would comment on. So one is you might call it nearshoring, or the movement maybe to Western Europe and North America, and that's happening, and we've seen that trend. And then there's a China for China trend that also is occurring right now. And I think each of those areas come with their own kind of integration questions and risks. But the way that we would look at the integration, say for a more standard acquisition, so as Jeff mentioned, right, the talent that's there on the team, that's number one. We're going to consider the customer relationships. Are they synergistic with our current customer base? Are they complementary? Is there additional opportunity to cross-sell within those customers? And evaluating the pipeline and understanding what's real and what isn't real, or what is a solid number versus a number maybe more developed in fantasy. That is part of the process. I would say we focus deeply on supply chain too, not just because of COVID, but we're a large supply chain company, so very often there's synergy that we can bring to bear. So that is something that we'd want to evaluate. And now, especially after the past 2 years, we're going to dig into the supply chain resiliency, and then also, understand if there's circular economy types of play, which our customers are more and more asking for. So the final area would be just the regional location. So we have a broad footprint in many locations around the globe. I wouldn't say it's a primary factor of what we're looking at, but if there is opportunity to leverage, existing infrastructure and overhead to tuck an acquisition in, that could be beneficial. But I wouldn't say that's the primary, driving criterion.
That's interesting, and obviously a very different set of problems versus a smaller specialized manufacturer like Cadence or Resonetics. Although I wouldn't call either company small, but definitely more specialized. Tom, Resonetics is the poster child for private equity involvement in the space. A long history, almost a decade, 4 generations of private equity ownership, many deals executed. You announced the latest one just yesterday. Congratulations. And we've been following your journey, and I wonder, obviously we've talked about long-term trends and how they are, how the landscape is changing, but you started off as a smaller organization putting together independent companies with dedicated capabilities, and you've done a great job of that. But now that you already have an established, successful platform with healthy growth, how do you view value creation from a M&A point of view? Is it the fact that you're now reached a different scale and different level of proficiency as an organization? Is it changing the compass of your inorganic strategy, or are you continuing to execute deals like you were 6 or 7 years ago when you started?
Yeah, that's a great question. We honestly haven't changed our playbook a whole heck of a lot. We still do smaller deals, even though we're getting bigger. The one curse of getting bigger is it takes more to move the needle. So, if you ask my private equity sponsors, would they like to invest more money and do bigger deals? Sure. But the bigger deals typically come with higher price tags and more integration headaches, et cetera. So we've been pretty happy looking for strategic buys that bring something new to the table, whether it's customer, capability, market, what have you, while continually keeping an eye out for larger deals as well. But again, you have to have discipline around pricing and know when it's time to walk away. I think I'll touch on another point that you raised in your line of questioning, which is we talk a lot about acquisitions and we don't talk a lot about integration. The real work is integration. And, I kind of have the easy job to help source deals, get deals done, and my operations team, quality team, engineering teams, they're the ones that do the heavy lifting by standardizing ERP systems, quality systems, cultural assimilations, et cetera. So I think, as we continue to get bigger and do 2-4 deals a year, integration becomes more of the gating item and the determinant whether a deal ultimately is successful. Because most of the companies we buy, as Jeff alluded to, you're heavily reliant on the management team, key technical individuals, and you don't want to spend a lot of money, buy a great company, and then see all the talent walk out the door because you screwed it up. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that piece, what happens after the deal closes.
But it's interesting the perspective that you continue to look at smaller deals, and it's something that resonates with what Joe was saying about finding the right capabilities and the right synergies, not necessarily to buy scale, and build brick by brick without taking too much scale risk. And
yeah, well, I think Jeff brought up that point too. When we were small, you could double your scale, right, with one acquisition or a couple of acquisitions. You can't do that now. And so it was simpler perhaps at that time, but you also have to be super careful you don't misstep and set yourself backwards. So I think that's the first edict, right, for any M&A is, first do no harm. Don't do a bad deal that sets you back a couple of years. And we've been pretty fortunate to avoid those. But yeah, I guess when you get bigger, it's a different set of challenges. But a lot of things are, run the course the same for a small or a larger company, I believe.
Great, thank you. I would like to open up the conversation, see if there are any questions from the audience.
First question for me is, what is small to Resonetics?
Small to Resonetics would be, less than 5 million EBITDA.
That's a very specific question. Thank you.
But the answer, we don't put there's no hard line in a deal that we won't do. We've done some deals with marginal or no profitability, some JVs, some minority investments. So you have to be flexible to get deals done in this environment.
I would be interested to know what is small for Flex.
2 years ago, I would have said small for Flex would have been less than 100 million in revenue annually as an acquisition target, simply because, again, to move the needle, a $2.5 billion company, you know, you need to get sufficient scale in the acquisition for it to even, you know, monitor or to be on the monitor. You know, I would say, given the rise in prices and, you know, our shift in our strategy, small now would probably, I would say, less than 50 million, you know, 30 to 50 million. Less than that would be very tiny for us. But again, if the technology is differentiated enough and we can craft a story around a revenue synergy, then, you know, that can still be meaningful.
Thank you, Joe. Any other questions out there? Gentleman over there.
From the panel on the impact of rising interest rates on valuations.
It's a macroeconomics question, right? My view is that obviously we are at inflection in the global economy for the many factors that we're all aware of. At the end of the day, monetary policy is a response to what the manufacturing industry was experiencing already for the last couple of years, which is a tremendous increase in the price of raw material. And I think our industry particularly, when also, you know, this problem was exacerbated by all the logistical disruption that happened during the pandemic and the slowdown of ground transportation, right? The scarcity of components, polymers for a period in early 2021 especially. So we're going through a lot, right? And I think these are ultimately business challenges that the supply chain industry and the contract manufacturing one is not immune to that. We'll have to deal with. You know, profits may shrink. Will these challenges present hurdles to growth, to top line growth? I think that needs to be determined. There are still some in medical device outsourcing, some strong fundamentals for accessing outsourced capacity. And so CDMOs still have, I think, quite a lot of upside. But specifically, how are rising interest rates going to impact M&A, right? I think there will be there may be a slowdown, but I think especially if we look at the data that my colleague presented earlier, you know, we feel our research indicates that we reached a peak in the volume of activity, and that there will be more careful selection for continued inorganic expansion by the market in general. So I think it's early to say if valuation will go down. We think they've reached a peak and a plateau perhaps. So I think interest rates are going to play a factor into this broader macro environment. And I'm just reporting kind of the insight of our research, but if you gentlemen have any other perspective on this, happy to hear you.
Sure. No, I think you covered it well. And Tony, I'd be interested in your perspective on this as well. But yeah, I mean, I think the basic economics would suggest that there'd be less money, less capital, cash chasing fewer deals, which has driven a lot of the higher valuations. So Cadence is not for sale right now. So we don't mind if there's a little dip in valuations as long as it comes back in a few years. So, but I would imagine it would be less cash to buy companies.
I would add there's still a lot of capital out there, and a lot of companies like the ones I work with are heavily levered. So no question, if interest rates go up, 200 or 300 basis points, they'll have to put more equity into their deals. So I think the real difference will be there'll be lower, return on cash for the private equity investors. It won't be as aggressive using debt. But I still feel like there's so much demand out there, so much capital, and where else are you going to invest your money these days? I think medical contract manufacturing looks pretty good and will continue to look good.
Any other question from the crowd? The lady down here.
So a lot of the topics we've been seeing at the shows have been around data automation of systems, the digital thread. So thinking of that, when you're looking at mergers and acquisitions, do you see the digitalization movement, is that an enabler? Or is that a completely separate decision that's going outside of M&A? Is this something that was making M&A easier? It's a key part of your M&A strategy, integration strategy? Or is that there are two completely different groups thinking about digitalization of your operations and M&A?
Two completely different groups, but with points of focus among them, I would say. So, you know, at Flex, we have an advanced engineering capability and a strategy around that, of which digitization, automation, additive manufacturing are among the strategies that we're pursuing, and we pursue that at the operations level. When we look at companies to potentially acquire, to be frank, we don't expect them to necessarily have the same, you know, level of, say, a simulation capability that we might have within our company, or real-time supply chain, again, because of the scale issue. So it is a factor, but it's more for us is how can we pull that into our ecosystem, as opposed to how can we leverage that particular company's IP. Now, that's from the health solutions, the medical standpoint. Now, the bigger company Flex, I know and I'm sure will pursue that type of intellectual property and acquisition, you know, whether it's software, digitization, automation, they will pursue that, you know, separately, but with the intent to integrate across the entire network.
Yeah, I would add, we think of it more operationally. How do we integrate more effectively? How do we provide a seamless solution to customers? And so we got a long way to go there. I'd be lying to say otherwise, but we have great aspirations to use digital transformation.
We had a question here.
So question for the panel. In your experience, what trend are you seeing in the market with respect to, is it more the PE companies wanting to invest in MedTech, or is it more the industrial companies wanting to invest and get into the MedTech area? And if you see a particular trend, do you see a trend with respect to size of the companies?
So just based on the data, and I think what the Alira folks have shown, I think it's more on the PE side. I don't know specifically, but you know, we've seen PE companies putting together platform plays, right? So you might call it a string of pearls strategy, but you know, they'll start with an anchor customer, an anchor target, an anchor company, and then they'll bolt on acquisitions or tuck-ins to create the scale that is meaningful enough to then potentially, you know, spin off or sell to an OEM. So I would say the volume of activity looks to be PE driven, but you know, the industrial companies that are entering or that have entered, not insignificant either, but they appear to be approaching more of a single target, single anchor target at scale, whereas the PEs are doing higher volume and putting together the strings of pearls.
Yeah, and Cadence is following that strategy, so that's exactly why Kohlberg purchased Cadence. But I would say also the other comment I would make is also the regional aspect. We've seen European industrial firms looking to get a foothold in the U.S. from a medical standpoint, so I think that's added to the dynamic as well, the regional side.
The only thing I would add is that if you go back 5, 6, 7 years ago, the strategic buyers, the industrial companies would always outbid, not always, but normally outbid the PE firms, and I think that's flipped, where now the PE firms are willing to pay higher multiples than the industrial companies. Not everywhere, but frequently. So I don't know if that will continue. You know, again, if interest rates start moving up, then it may flip back the other way. But right now, it's a good situation because you have buyers coming from lots of different directions, and that's what's driving prices so high.
It's a great point, Tom. From our point of view, we've seen almost a convergence. While in the past, private equities were not willing to pay very high multiple, they've started to pay higher valuations. But at the same time, industrial companies that want an entry into the medical field may not have a tolerance for the valuation, of our industry, and of course they like the profit margins, but they don't know how to correlate that with their cost of capital. So it's a quite mitigated difference now. I think everybody plays according to the same rule, and I agree, Tom. There's a diversity of capital provenance there that is very, very interesting to see that happening just versus 5 years ago. Any other questions? I have one more question for the panel. So we were supposed to have a private equity guy, and this would have been a good question for him from my point of view. So I will frame it to the gentleman here. So of course we talked a lot about private equity in continued capital allocation, and there's a lot of capital out there that is continuing to try to break into this industry. We've seen a first generation of successful exits that are continuing to drive interest, and private equity is buying smaller assets to build them from the ground up, much like Resonetics started almost a decade ago. So what is the game plan for the industry in your view? Where is it gonna lead us 5-10 years from today as the industry consolidation continues, and perhaps exit opportunities will become fewer, and how will the market adjust to this secular trend of industry consolidation?
It's a great question. I would say one of the big determining factors will be what the OEM trends are in terms of how much they outsource the business. So you hear different stories from different OEMs. I think everyone's familiar with the Jabil, J&J situation. If that trend continues, do the medical device OEMs go the route of the pharma, where they're just sales and marketing and R&D arms, and they're outsourcing all their manufacturing? If that trend continues, this market continues to be more and more attractive. If it doesn't, then there may be some limited growth in that space. So to me, I guess I'll let the other panelists comment on specifically on the exits, but I would say for me, that's the big trend, is just what happens from an outsourcing standpoint with the OEMs.
I think that's a strong point, and I agree. The other thing that I'm not sure of, as if you look at the larger, he mentioned Jabil, but if you look at the larger industry, how many large at-scale players can there be in the CDMO space? Revenues above $1 billion, $2 billion. There's a point where the OEMs, start playing all the CDMOs against each other, and then margins collapse, and it becomes a pretty rough industry. So I could see in the future, more consolidation on the CDMO side among companies. So it's a cardiovascular and an orthopedic company combining to provide a more complete offering to a J&J or a Medtronic. But I don't think in 10 years that there will be 10 $2 billion plus medical CDMOs.
I might disagree with that because I think there will be, but I think it'll mirror the OEM customers. If you look at the cardiovascular space, it's dominated by Edwards, Medtronic, Boston, Abbott, and then you have startups, and the startups are the R&D labs for the large OEMs. I think the same dynamic will happen in our space where there's always room for a smart, nimble supplier. But their relationship may be coming with the prime vendor, the larger CDMO company, and they'll get bought by one of those. I think it'll be harder for a real small supplier to make inroads at an Edwards, a Medtronic, a J&J, just because they're really closing things down more and more. But there's always a way when you're innovative. To be a mid-sized player, I think, is the real danger zone, where you could get stuck in the middle. You don't have scale to be a real strategic, and maybe you're not as nimble as some of the smaller specialists out there. So that, to me, would be the red flag. I wouldn't want to be caught in the middle.
Yeah, I feel the same. And I wonder how many in the audience are entrepreneurs or own small, mid-sized manufacturing shops. Is there any representation here? Not much. Over there, from overseas? A few. So this is a great point, and Alira serves the mid-small market. We work with a lot of entrepreneurs or mid-sized private equity-backed organizations, and of course, this has been in the last few years a seller's market with a lot of demand for capacity, right? So smaller and mid-sized companies are in a favorable position to sell their business now. But as this trend consolidates and the industry becomes more concentrated, right? One of the big questions that I put out there, and if the panel has any insight, is what's going to happen with these smaller service providers, right? That do not have the scale and do not have the ability to follow their OEM customers in their growth. And one of the trends that to me is particularly interesting for research is how is medical device innovation going to fuel the need for smaller, more nimble, entrepreneurial service providers, right? And is that kind of side of the market, the scale, the startup world sufficient to sustain a whole industry, right? We count more than 150 service providers in North America under $30 million in revenue, right? So the big question mark is what's going to happen to that part of the market. And if the panel has any insight about this, it would be very interesting to know. But it remains to be determined, in my view, as a long-term trend.
I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I mean, you can walk around downstairs and there's probably 800 companies that are exhibiting. My guess is there'll be 800 companies here 5 years from now. But again, it's going to be harder. I think you're going to have to make sure, if you're small, that you really do offer something different, something special. But we all know that lots of these small suppliers have very tight relationships with a customer in a geography around a capability. And if you have that kind of sticky business, there's nothing to say it can't run its course for quite some time.
Yeah, I agree. I think if the small supplier is differentiated, if they're bringing something unique to the table, if they're designed into a finished device, that can be powerful. I will say, in the past 2 years, a lot of the challenges that we, as Flex, were asked to help overcome on the OEM side was to support supply chain resiliency, where the smaller suppliers just simply could not keep up, or they could not adjust quickly enough during COVID. That was already an issue prior to COVID, and then COVID really exacerbated that. So that challenge will remain. So if the dynamic continues on the OEM side for supply chain consolidation and resiliency, you need to bring something unique to the table, I think.
Yeah, I agree with all the comments. I think the only other thing that I would add is just where are your relationships with your OEM customers? Because R&D is very important, as you said, to be designed into the product, and that's where the speed comes into play. But then the sourcing team is the one who determines what the supplier is at the production level. So that's where you need the scale and capacity. So if you can offer both, then I think you're in a very good position to continue to grow.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? We have room for another one, perhaps. All right. Well, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your perspective. Please join me in a big round of applause for. Thank you for giving us your generous time today. And we will be available, at least personally, I and my team, in the next few minutes, if you guys want to have any other question or follow up on the topics that we discussed today. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you next year.